Hi everybody, welcome back to our class on leadership. Sorry about that, my video just stopped. We were talking though about the work of Alan Bryman and the 6 perspectives or views on leadership which he identified in the leadership literature. We're going to slightly translate Bryman's ideas and we're going to focus on research that looks at the traits that leaders have. We're going to think about situational leadership, which focuses on matching styles to contexts, and we're going to think about transformational leadership as an example of new leadership literature. And finally, we'll talk about critical views of leadership. So, trait theories. We're going to look at 2 trait theories. We're going to look at what I think you can call the great man or great men approach to leadership and the dramaturgical role theory of leadership. Dramaturgical roles. So great man theory suggests that leaders, effective leaders, have particular types of personalities, particular traits, and even particular physical characteristics. So classic trait theory focused typically on great men. So there was an assumption that to be an effective leader, you firstly had to be a man. You often had to be a man of a particular type. There's research showing that taller men tend to be more effective leaders than shorter men, and a whole host of what you could probably call kind of questionable stereotypes now at the heart of this leadership. It got translated from physical traits to psychological traits, though, following the Second World War. Stodgill in particular is an example of this approach. He argued that good leaders have particular types of personalities. They often are very self-confident. They are extroverts, if we think back to our examples in our personality lecture. They have a willingness to tolerate frustration and delay. They have a willingness to accept consequences for their decisions. They are ready to absorb interpersonal stress. They have high emotional intelligence, strong resilience. Again, to use some of the terms from our earlier class. Now, the key point here is trait theory focuses on the type of person or type of personality that good leaders are thought to have. Later research went and actually interviewed leaders themselves to see what kind of qualities or personal traits did they think that leaders tended to have. And there's a fairly short list of traits that people tend to associate with good leaders. They tend to think that good leaders need to be decisive, have ambition, be dependable, have a great deal of energy, foresight, good human relation skills, strong emotional stability. What all this means then is that to be a good leader, you need to have the right type of traits and qualities in advance. The great man approach to leadership that focuses on particular types of people being good leaders very much sees leaders as being born, not made. A second trait theory, though, suggests that actually these traits can be used or can be displayed by anybody. You don't have to be born in a certain way to be a good leader. You just have to perform or appear a certain way to be a good leader. So this builds on organisational dramaturgy, as we've spoken about before, to think about leadership as a type of character or a role that somebody will act out or portray. And a good example of this would be recent discussions of Elizabeth Holmes, famous in the popular business press for creating a really valuable startup company. And it was clear that Holmes was very stylised in her personal interactions. She really wanted to appear as having a whole host of traits to the extent that she even reportedly changed how she spoke and how she appeared to give off leadership traits. The difference then between trait theory and dramaturgy is trait theory thinks that people are born with the traits. The dramaturgy, organisational dramaturgy perspective says, well, actually anybody can appreciate what the traits of good leaders are and then just act out, make it appear as though they have them. So those are the trait theories we're going to look at. And hopefully you can see how each of them focuses on the type of person that the leader is. Inherently then, they each assume that there's only one style of leaders. There's only good leadership, and good leaders have particular types of traits. That's the fundamental assumption of trait theory. A second approach to thinking about leadership is to suggest that actually there are different styles of leadership, that some people might have to have these traits, but not everybody. That you can be a different style of leader. You don't have to be a great man. You could be more sympathetic, more empathetic, that there's different traits. There's the good cop and the bad cop. Evidence for this comes from a variety of research. Bales and Slater, who we've talked about earlier on the course, they suggested that you can have very task-orientated leaders and more emotionally orientated leaders. Task-orientated leaders, they say, focus on getting the work done. They have much more emphasis on expressing their opinions, giving information, and getting the work completed in time. Socio and emotional leaders are much more interested in maintaining group harmony, and they are more focused on speaking to and listening to the team members and creating and developing and maintaining bonds between the group members. The key point for Bales and Slater, though, is that actually these two styles of leadership are necessary at different times. There are times when it's important to focus on the task, and there are also times when it's important to focus on maintaining social bonds. So we start to get the idea then that there's not just one way of being a good leader. There are different styles of leadership which might be needed at different times. Lewin and Leppert, in another pretty famous study here, studied groups of teenagers in, I think it was like a holiday resort. And actually it wasn't a holiday resort, I believe. It was a welfare home. But each group of children was given an adult leader. And they noticed that the adults tended to adopt particular ways of leading. There would be democratic leaders who were much more focused on the group members. They were more listening, more friendly, more approachable. They tended to be interested in fostering trust and respect amongst the group. But then there were authoritarian leaders. The authoritarian leaders were more task-orientated. They tended to focus on achievement, giving orders. They would often be critical of the team members without actually giving any feedback or reasons for their criticisms. So from these two quite famous studies, we get the idea that there are different styles of leadership, different ways of doing leadership. And the key point in style and contingency approaches to leadership is that no one way is best in all situations, but there are particular ways of leading which are best in other situations. Another example of different styles is Likert, who suggests that the style of leadership tends to develop based on a number of organisational features. So he said, when there's no trust or confidence in subordinates, leaders will tend to be more exploitative and autocratic. They'll motivate by threat, they won't communicate, they won't look for teamwork, because they don't trust anybody, right? They just want to treat people almost like computers or machines, tell them what to do, get them to do it, shout at them if they don't do it. When there is some trust, but it's a sort of superficial trust, leaders often display what Likert describes as benevolent but authoritative style. So they'll pretend to listen to their subordinates, but really impose the decision that they want without delegating. They might motivate by reward rather than threat, and sometimes involve subordinates in the problem solving, but ultimately they'll treat subordinates as just that, people who are beneath them, who they control. Participative leaders tend to have more trust in their subordinates. They tend to listen to their subordinates, but still want to maintain control of decision making. So a participative leader might be willing to hear suggestions from their subordinates, but ultimately they want to make the decision. A fully democratic leader, however, will have complete trust in their subordinates and allow subordinates to make decisions for themselves. So you can see how these styles that Likert sets out depend on the level of trust between leaders and followers. The notion that there are particular organisational factors or features of organisations which shape the style of leadership and shape what the situation calls for has been the focus of a real strong stream of the literature ever since. So we start to see the idea of context fitting, the idea that the style of leadership needs to depend on an appreciation of the situation. So Tannenbaum and Schmidt said it depends on the manager themselves. Some managers are naturally not very good at being participative or democratic. Some are not very good at being authoritarian. It depends on the subordinates. Do the subordinates want to be independent and make their own decisions? We often assume that people do. When we talk about workplace motivation and high motivated teams, high performance teams, we assume that subordinates want a great deal of autonomy in their decision making, but that's not true in every situation. Sometimes followers want a leader. They want to be given clear direction. And finally, of course, the context depends on the situation. What are the organisational norms? What's the nature of the problem? Some problems work really well by giving followers or subordinates a great deal of autonomy, but if you're making, say, computer microchips, you need to make sure everyone's putting the right thing in the right place, or it won't work. So, unlike trait theory, the leadership styles approach says, firstly, there are different ways of being a good leader. So, there's different styles of leadership. And then there are different contexts which make different styles of leadership, effective or not. And this has led to a whole host of different problems, different ways of thinking about how to match the style of leadership to the context. We won't talk through this slide, we've talked through that already. And this draws on what's known as contingency theory. Contingency theory says that effective leaders don't have particular traits or even a particular style, rather they have situational awareness. Right? They understand themselves, their subordinates, and the situation, and are able to change their style of leadership to ensure that it matches the context. So this is called contingency theory because it says the style of leadership is contingent on the context. And Felder sets out 3 typical conditions which leaders find themselves in. He suggests that in the first instance, tasks may be structured, the power will be concentrated in the leader, and relationships will be good. And this is a situation in which task-orientated leaders tend to do very well. Because the task is structured, people need to be told what to do. Because the organisational context means that leaders have a high degree of power, people are expecting them to tell them what to do, and so you get good relationships. If the task is unstructured and power is low, and relationships are modestly good, task-orientated leaders tend to do poorly. Why? Well, because they don't have a great deal of power to tell people what to do. Because their subordinates have a relatively good relationship with them and are expecting more autonomy and more input into the decisions, because the task is unstructured and probably more problematic and up for debate, it's very hard for leaders to operate in a sort of top-down manner. And then the final condition which Felder suggests is common is ones in which there's an unstructured task, the power is low, and relationships are poor. And Felder says when this happens, task-orientated leaders now tend to do much better. Why? Well, the task is still unstructured and the management power is still low, but because relationships between leaders and subordinates are already poor, because relationships perhaps between subordinates are poor and there's a low level of trust throughout the organisation, leaders can rely on what Weber would call their legitimate power. Right? They are people who have the leadership roles, so they can turn around to people and say, ultimately, I'm the boss, you have to do what I tell you. If you don't like it, leave. Bringing all this together, the more recent literature, although it is still quite old, but it's very popular still, has focused on what they call situational leadership, which really is just a term for what we've been talking about up to now. It's a term for contingent leadership. It's a term for leaders which emphasises that leaders need to have situational awareness and match their style to the context. Hershey and Blanchard set out a popular model, which, if you ever go on leadership training, you'll most likely see, which suggests that there are different situations that call for different styles of leadership. We'll just quickly talk about the styles. They say in some instances, strong leaders need to delegate, right? And this is when they're in a situation where, whether it's because of the nature of the task or the organizational relationships, it's going to be more effective for them to let their followers decide how to do things themselves. Leaders might set the overall goals, they might set the goals, set the agenda, but in terms of how to execute or achieve those goals, they need to delegate. There's also situations in which it makes more sense and it's more effective for leaders to be participatory. Not necessarily delegating all power over to the followers, but to involve followers in decisions. Then there's situations in which the leader needs to make the decisions themselves, but they need to bring the team on board with them. This is a model of leadership which is known as selling. And finally, there are situations in which it doesn't matter whether you've sold your decision or not, or participated your followers into the decision, or even delegated to them. There are situations in which it's more effective to tell people what to do, to be more authoritative. You'll probably see how these concepts match on quite closely to, a lot of the stuff we've already spoke about, whether it's Fielder's ideas, whether it's Tannenbaum and Schmidt's ideas of context, whether it's Leichert's description of different leadership styles. The point is really the same across the contingency approach. It's about matching style to context. So that takes us then to our discussion of transformational leadership, which Bryman describes as part of the new leadership literature. Transformational leaders are thought to adopt a new style of leadership, one which is not simply based on telling people what to do, but rather one in which the focus is much more on inspiring followers to do even better, to perform even better than anybody could predict in the future. So this is often contrasted with transactional leadership, where the leader tells somebody what to do, and if they do the right thing, they either get a reward or avoid a punishment, sort of do what I say approach. Transformational leaders are thought to inspire and improve the performance through motivation and autonomy. So they ask their followers to just do great things. There's a whole group of authors who have written about this, and they suggest a number of things, but one is that transformational leaders tend to focus on leading and developing others. They tend to be able to show genuine concern, they tend to empower their subordinates to encourage change, but they're accessible. They tend to be very transparent and inspirational. They have very distinct personal qualities. And they tend to lead organisations from the front. They want to support particular types of culture, build shared visions, create really strong, powerful teams, and transform their subordinates rather than lead them. The new leadership literature also talks about the importance of strategic leadership, the importance of leaders focusing on the high-level strategic or long-range issues to set the mission and culture for an organisation, to ensure buy-in into that mission and culture, but leave details to subordinates, to trust subordinates to figure things out for themselves. One of the recent additions here has been the notion of extreme ownership, the idea that transformational leaders set a strategy, pick their teams, leave their teams to do the work in the best way that they can, but do so with the freedom that the leaders will own the decisions, that they'll develop a no-blame culture, that any blame for what happens will be focused on the leaders, that leaders lead from the front and take ownership of what they do. Okay, so we've talked about trait theories, we've talked about style and contingency theories, and now we just briefly talked about some transformational perspectives on leadership. Let's quickly just as way of a bit of a wrap up, think about some of the critical issues with leadership. So far we've talked about different ways of doing leadership and what makes good leaders. And a lot of the literature on leadership has quite a positive, almost spiritual flavour to it. The idea that leaders solve problems for organisations, that leaders inspire people, that leadership is something all organisations need and all teams need in some degree. Well, a whole host of critical authors have suggested that this very positive view of leadership, while it has some truth to it, overlooks some of the truths about leadership. In particular, the idea that leadership isn't necessarily just about inspiring and transforming. It can also be quite a dominating, negative experience for people. So there's a number of streams in the critical literature. A kind of trait theory stream has looked at the types of gender biases, racial biases, and other what we would call protected characteristics, which tend to be associated with leadership, right? So the idea that great man theory, right, is built into it, that leaders are supposed to be men. Well, critical scholars, particularly feminist critical scholars, take issue with that and say, well, why do you have to be a man to be a good leader? Psychological researchers have suggested that leaders, even transformational leaders, often display a sort of narcissism, that they can often end up using their followers and their teams and their organisations to support their own neuroses, right, to make themselves feel better. We've talked about this when we talked about conflict and power in organisations, the idea that leaders can sometimes use their subordinates. They can engage in abusive supervision, right? They can bully people beneath them. They have power, legitimate power, and sometimes leaders mistake their legitimate power for illegitimate sources of power. They think that because they're in charge, they can bully people around as if they had coercive pure power. Knowing that their subordinates can't answer them back, knowing that their subordinates can't, turn around and be violent against them, makes them seem very, very powerful. And you often see this in critical leadership studies, discussions of the little big man, the little leader. The idea that people who attain leadership positions often have some sort of neuroses about them, which they look to compensate for in their leadership style. The critical literature has also emphasised that many transformational leaders transform their organisations to develop very toxic cultures. Rather than creating positive cultures, leaders can push their followers to engage in unethical and even illegal behaviours. And this is Dick Fuld, former CEO of Lehman Brothers, who encouraged his stockbrokers to engage in increasingly risky behaviours and talked about killing the competition and, acting like guerrillas and being these really wild, savage people that took no prisoners. And this created a very toxic culture in which nobody in the organisation could stop, ask critical questions about what the organisation was doing, and it led to huge social turmoil. Ultimately, the critical literature focuses on the issue of personification. This takes us back to where we started with Max Weber's legitimate and illegitimate forms of leadership. There's a sense There's a sense in the critical scholarship that too much contemporary leadership literature focuses on leaders rather than the activities involved in leadership. And it ignores the fact that in most organisations there's a whole host of leadership that takes place which isn't done by leaders. This is a point particularly emphasised by Carl Rhodes and Peter Bloom in their book CEO Society. The idea that all the world's problems, they say, can be solved by some specific heroic superhumans, some geniuses, some like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs style geniuses, personifies leadership and associates it with particular types of people, going back to trait theory. But their argument is actually, in most organisations, and particularly effective organisations, there is leadership that exists separately to leaders. In the critical literature, it's suggested that this means there's particular biases and that leadership can be used to exploit people, that leaders get highly paid, take all the benefits, even though they don't necessarily bear the costs or the risks or the responsibility for what they're doing. So the critical leadership asks questions around the accountability of leaders and asks whether some of these more positive ideas about transformational leadership really play out on the ground. Okay, so that takes us hopefully to the end of the class. This might have been a bit of a long video, but we've defined leadership, we've talked about trait theory, style, contingency theories, transformational perspectives on leadership, and briefly summarised some of the critical issues associated with contemporary leadership. If you've got any questions, please leave them on the discussion forums or come to one of the drop-in Q&A sessions.